Signore e signori, buonasera. Ok, buonasera, fiappo. Signore e signori, buonasera. Just slightly better. Thank you for being here. My name is Stefano Albertini. I'm the director of Casa Italiana at zerilli-marimò at New York University. On behalf of the whole staff at the Casa, the Department of Italian Studies, its chairman, Eugenio Refini here, welcome. We are delighted to have you here in the auditorium and to have about 40 of you in the library upstairs. It's a very important evening for us. It marks the first time we show Elvira Notari Beyond Silence at the Casa. We proudly co-produced it in a manner that was measured to our capacity, but we believed in this project from the very beginning. We're going to talk about the film in a minute, but in order to prepare you for the film, we have a real treat. We have a lecture now by Professor Giuliana Bruno, and I'm going to introduce Giuliana in a second. I just want to say that she's the first person that really digged out Elvira Notari from the oblivion of history. It doesn't happen very often that you have that role, and that happened about several years ago when Giuliana was a PhD student here at New York University. She went on to have an incredibly successful career. She's now the Emmett Blakeney Gleason Research Professor of Visual and Environmental Studies at Harvard University, and she's recognized as one of the authorities in the field of visual arts and visual studies. But tonight she's going back to, we can say, her first academic love, that is Elvira Notari, a woman from Naples, like Giuliana. So I take this not only as a great chance to hear one of the most brilliant scholars of visual studies and cinema studies, but also to celebrate something that comes to a complete circle. And for those of you who are interested, there are copies of Giuliana's book on Elvira Notari upstairs, and she'll be happy to sign them during the reception. I hope you will stay for the film, but between the lecture and the film, we're going to have a break, and the little snack, of course, having to do with Naples, is going to be pizza. But very important, since we expect even more people arriving just for the film, leave something precious on the chair, not too precious, and then do whatever you can to come back and claim your seat again. We'll do what we can to keep it, but we cannot hold every single seat. So we have a great evening, and if I started telling you all the publications by Professor Bruno and all the honors that she received, we would be here until the pizza is cold. So I know we are here to listen to her and to listen to her journey of discovery of Elvira Notari. And I'm also very interested in knowing how she feels in this re-resurrection of Elvira, thanks to this film. And we're going to have time to talk about the film after. And lecture, reception, film, Q&A. Please welcome Professor Giuliana Bruno.
Thank you very much, Stefano, and the Casa Italiana of New York University for this invitation and this lovely. I am, emozionata. You ask how I felt, how I feel, and it is an emotional evening. It is going, full back to what was really my dissertation. So it's a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak of this book that he discovered, Elvira Notari. And okay, better? Great. I could say it was over 30 years ago, here with you, having especially a new filmic life. So I'd like to thank the filmmakers, Valerio Ciriaci, Isaac Lipsing, Mila Tenaglia, and the film producer Antonella Di Nocera for being inspired to bring this great story back to life in their documentary Elvira Notari Beyond Silence that you're about to see after the reception and this talk. And I'd like to thank everyone for coming, many, many dear friends. Some of them couldn't even get the seat, so thanks for coming today. Really, this means a lot to me, full circle journey over here. Okay, so Elvira, eccola qua. Elvira Notari, the exceptional woman to whom I devoted my book Streetwalking on a Ruined Map that was first published in 1993, was a pioneer of cinema. She was born in 1875 and deceased in 1946. When I began to research her work in the 80s, her extraordinary role and extensive film production had long, actually for decades, been eclipsed by both history and the history of cinema. So Elvira needed to be rediscovered in a role as Italy's first and most prolific woman filmmaker. As director of her own production company called Dora Film, after her daughter, Notari made 60 feature films between 1906 and 1930. Of this extensive production, only 3 films remain: A Piccerella, The Little Girl, from 1922, which will, by the way, screen a film forum tomorrow night at 6 o'clock with my introduction and live music, A Santa Notte, The Holy Night, also from 1922, and Fantasia Surdato, a soldier's fantasy from 1927. Notari also made hundreds of documentaries and short films, but unfortunately, almost all have been lost. This loss and lack of critical consideration formed the dismal scenario I encountered when I began to reconstruct the work almost 40 years ago. There was no internet, no search engines or websites, and no eBay, let alone any digitization of the films or any of the documents. So the search for the dispersed material of Notari's film production was truly an adventure. It involved an extensive street walking across 2 continents, from the winding streets of Naples to the straight avenue of New York. Many stories accumulated as I traveled to wherever a remnant might be found, perusing unusual sites and unearthing private collections. Various strategies had to be invented, not just to open the doors of the Italian archive, also because, as we all know, the Italian archive didn't function as places of circulation, but rather as enclosed sites of possibly preservation. And it was not always comfortable for a young woman to peruse dilapidated Neapolitan warehouses that might have once been a film production house, or visiting gritty Italian-American social clubs in New York, Little Italy, and in Brooklyn. Finally, this search, which lasted many years and traversed diverse disciplinary territories, resulted in a book manuscript. The 1993 edition of Streetwalking on a Ruined Map, Cultural Theory and the City Films of Elvira Notari was followed in 1995 by the Italian edition entitled Rovine con vista alla ricerca del cinema perduto di Elvira Notari. The ruined titles of the books in both languages were intended to emphasize both the search and the loss of Notari's films, as well as the forgetting of a role. The silent women filmmakers had in fact been silenced by both institutional and personal circumstances. Furthermore, much as I searched, I didn't find any interviews or any written statements by Notari herself. The book theorizes these lacunae. The silence that characterized the story of this pioneering woman filmmaker became a theoretical meditation on the margins, on lacunae, on empty spaces. I am therefore more than delighted that her work has now found a new voice beyond the silence through the film that you're about to see. By reflecting on the changes of these 30 years in the new 2023 Italian edition of my book, I maintain that the ruined map must be made visible when rediscovering a lost practice marginalized by history. Reflecting on the ruined map from the very beginning, I came to see that the silence surrounding Elvira Notari had several causes. Not only her film production, but Elvira's very role was overlooked by the fact that as a woman, she could not legally be the head of her own production company. The credits for directing and producing were often assigned to her husband, Nicola, who worked alongside her as a cameraman. Elvira, on the other hand, was a true entrepreneur, as well as the director of all les films, a term that was originally feminine in the early days of cinema. She founded her own Manifattura Cinematografica, film manufacturer in Naples, after promoting a family business that had been coloring films frame by frame, one by one. From this early sartorial activity, which she had also pursued as a millionaire, fashion is always the most inventive thing, she came up with the idea of producing and editing films, a craft that also involved cutting and sewing. It was no coincidence that it was mainly women that I discovered worked in the editing rooms of film production companies and hand-colored the films. These women worked in cinema as much as they did at their sewing machines, attentively slicing and connecting pieces of material gathered in domestic artisanal laboratories. But while most remained mere laborers in film production, Elvira was one of the few who, from hand-coloring films, went on to found her own production company. Notari not only directed les films of Dora Film, but also wrote them as a screenwriter. She was involved in all stages of pre- and post-production and distribution, and even ran an acting school. One could say that she raised her actors. Her son Eduardo, who appears in her film from early childhood, literally grew up on his mother's screen. He was known as an actor by the Pasolinesque name of Gennariello. Notari's vast production was eventually suppressed, silenced by fascist censorship. She was greatly hindered because of her Neapolitanism, evident in her use of dialect in subtitles and in her portrayal of social situations of poverty, theft, and illegality, realities that the fascist regime did not want disseminated. Nor was it acceptable to depict women the way she did, independent, strong-willed, and free to move in the urban environment. There was also explicit eroticism, for these women did not shy away from their sexual desires. Notari's career ended in 1930, when she could no longer withstand fascist censorship and when the advent of sound made artisanal film production in Naples untenable. The city of Naples, its architecture, are a central character of my book because Notari shot on location, depicting real urban life. Anticipating post-war neorealism, her films capture the city's topography, the mix of architectural styles, and the energy of urban rhythms. She was particularly drawn to views and panoramas. Her compositions bear the influence of art history, especially vedutismo, or view painting. Since the 17th century, Naples had been central to this pictorial architectural genre that aestheticized its famous gulf and vistas. But Notari's views of Naples did not overlook the social conditions of the poor depicted in their homes and in street life. They continued a local tradition of pictorial and photographic realism, as well as of literary verismo. The hardship of urban life for lower-class women are consistently foregrounded. Fierce, sensuous, and rebellious, these women assert their freedom, but not always successfully. Punished, they may be confined to mental hospitals or reduced to corpses on anatomical tables. Sfregiate, scared, they are also tragically depicted in the guise of those female martyrs so often figured and disfigured in art history. Filmed in the alleyways of Naples, her surviving melodramas emerged directly from the body of the city's popular culture, an urban corpo reality where artistic iconography and icons coincide. The story of Notari's production I've just so easily summarized for you was not so simple to reconstruct. Given the loss and the silence, how did I come to gather these views of Notari's film production from a ruined map? In the absence of most over 60 feature films and hundreds of short films, revealing the complexity of her work required inventing a method. It was not enough to simply analyze her 3 extant films, as one publisher suggested I do. To write a single authorial study or a monograph, as was very customary at the time, would also be restrictive from my point of view. I needed to formulate a new method of inquiry capable of illuminating the historical contribution of Notari's lacunar production by exploring the cultural terrain in which she operated. And so I embarked on a series of inferential walks through various artistic mediums. Writing this book became a real process of streetwalking through literature, photography, art history, architectural history, urban studies, and the history of medicine, as well as film history. Working in this transdisciplinary way, I linked the fragmentary images of her production that I unearthed to the larger visual culture. Anticipating what is now called and established as visual studies and media archaeology, I created networks of visual communication through the different mediatic materials that emerged through my method of streetwalking. These included film fragments, stills, photographs, but also the photo that portrayed the filmmakers or the location, as well as publicity and industry documents such as flyers, posters, and advertisements. Then I interpreted them in relation to art historical, photographic, and literary imaging to reveal their iconographic history and visual impact. I also turned to critical writings in journals to understand whether this pioneering woman filmmaker was discussed at all in the press of the time and how she was received. Furthermore, by mining the censorship visas, I gathered crucial information about how Notari could or could not make films under the dictatorship that ultimately silenced her. While exposing this cultural, visual, and social fabric of which her films were a part, I theoretically reflected on the complexity at stake in my enterprise. This intermediate processual method of reconstruction ultimately traced the visual history of the city of Naples, my hometown. The scholarly book does not shy away from acknowledging this subjective investment. As the filmmaker Mario Martone writes, the book, quote, can be read as a travelogue. We set out on a journey and follow 2 paths. One, rigorous and invaluable, is the meticulous analytical reconstruction of Elvira Notari's cinema. The other, barely conceived by a highbrow yet accessible critical lens, is the personal perspective of the woman who wrote the book, end quote. This book does indeed tell a personal story. It is a dialogue between 2 women across the ruins of time. In the restoration of a ruined work of art, one often even feels the handiwork, even the hand of the restorer. This touch, the apticity of restoration, inspired my attempt to reconstruct Notari's vision from interconnected visual fragments. I became fascinated by the contemporary method of preservation of frescoes. From a distance, the restored image may appear seamless, and yet, if one approaches the fresco and looks up close, the absences become visible. The reconstructed areas have a different texture, almost like a screen surface. This approach offered me a powerful analogy for my own work of reconstruction. It was particularly suited to a partially lost filmic production because it is fundamentally cinematic, based on movement and an act of screening. Like the restorer's hand, my own handiwork can also be felt in the book, in moments of intimate theoretical interpretation. Let me offer you one example. It comes from detailed film program notes distributed in movie theaters, as was customary in stage theaters or opera houses. In one case, I found an extensive plot summary and images from the lost film Escugnize, Female Urgings from 1917. When you see these images again in the documentary Elvira Notari, Beyond Silence, you will understand how I felt when I first uncovered them. Before my eyes was a vivid evidence of gender, class, and social struggle. Maria, a popolana, a woman of the people, had been the lover of an upper-class doctor who had borne his child. Forced by his family, who opposed the marriage, he abandons her. Her child is taken away from her and ultimately murdered. In despair, Maria goes mad. Notari composed a haunting image of this woman confined in a mental hospital with other women. Neglected, the institution burns, and Maria perishes in the flames. Unclaimed, the body of his popolana is handed over to medical science for experimentation. In the final image, Maria lies exposed on an anatomical table, barely veiled, surrounded by 13 male doctors subjected to their gaze. She's about to be operated upon by the chief physician. The cut inflicted by the anatomical knife will be perpetrated by the very man who had abandoned her, driving her to insanity and death. I know, this is pretty, it's pretty melodramatic, okay. Well, how can I not think of those female anatomical models in scientific museums, the so-called waxen Venus, or not consider the long theatrical history of hysteria, madness, and the anatomy lesson? I was compelled to write 2 or even 3 chapters of my book on this material, bringing together art history, psychoanalysis, cultural and feminist theory to articulate a new discourse on the origin of film language. Notari's image of laceration became a site for reflecting upon visual operations, or rather what's known today as operational images. It exposed the fragmentation of film language as embodied as a theater of the body. The cut Notari stages revealed to me that the cinematic act of cutting a film has its root in the spectacle of the anatomical theater. This corporeal theatricality, long represented in art history, prefigures the very birth of spectatorship. Notari's melodramas, lived and embodied by the women of Naples, were truly corporeal. They were produced by the belly of Naples, a metropolis, her metropolis, her mother city. Naples had traditionally made a spectacle of privacy through the mixed architectural styles of the city. As Walter Benjamin and Assia Lachis wrote, this is a porous city whose theatrical architecture creates, and I quote, the Baroque opening of an intensified public sphere, end quote. This architectural porosity, this intermingling, and a constant motion towards a theater of the new provided fertile ground for Notari's cinema. If film, a new medium, took root in the urban landscape, then street life took root in her cinema. Through the truly moving images of this extraordinary female pioneer, the city of Naples itself began to travel. One of my greatest discoveries was that Notari's production participated in a remarkable process of cultural migration. Her filmic urban views circulated not only across Italy, but far beyond its borders and reached New York City. Alongside the great wave of southern Italian migration at the turn of the century, her motion pictures also crossed the ocean. Dora Film did more than travel. It established a presence abroad. In New York, a city with a large immigrant population, Elvira Notari effectively realized the American dream, and her company became Dora Film of America. Notari opened an office at 729 7th Avenue in Manhattan, which served as a hub for distributing Neapolitan films throughout North and South America. Elvira Notari's images of Naples resonated strongly within Italian-American communities, not only in New York, but also in cities like Pittsburgh and Baltimore. They also circulated widely in South America, especially in Brazil and Argentina, where immigrant audiences in São Paulo and Buenos Aires embraced them with enthusiasm. Advertisements for Dora film productions that I found were often prominently featured, sometimes occupying more space than those for operas like the Aida or La Traviata. Notari's films reached the United States even before they reached Rome. In this way, she circumvented fascist censorship, allowing a public of immigrants to see her films as she conceived them before the cuts and the changes were imposed by the regime. So the New York audience was actually the only one to encounter her original cinematic vision of the city of Naples. This transatlantic journey also carried the city's musicality. Silent cinema was never truly silent. Notari's films were shaped by the Neapolitan songs that accompanied, even structured, the narrative. Working within the sceneggiata tradition, she developed a distinctive mise-en-scène of music, with singers always performing live, even in front of the screen, in a multimedia performance avant la lettre. With their musical rhythms and striking realism, shot on location long before neorealism, Notari's film allowed migrants to return home virtually. They transformed memory. No longer Proustian, it became mediated, taking the form of resounding, moving images of places. Her cinema's success, then, was not simply rooted in nostalgia, but in a transport. As a new medium, film offered a way to negotiate the displacement of modernity and modernization. It became a space where immigrants and local audiences alike could reimagine social roles, gender norms, and new desires. For many women viewers in Naples and in New York, Notari's film provided a sense of social participation and the intimate pleasure of popular novels. In the space that I like to call public intimacy, a public space where people came together intimately, cultures and languages merged, producing new hybrid identities. The Naples-New York circuit also generated an unexpected development. Spectators became filmmakers. In the mid-1920s, Italian-American immigrants commissioned Dora Film to produce hundreds of short documentaries depicting their hometowns, the streets, the houses, and the relatives they had left behind. These films that documented the urban body, the physiognomy of place, functioned as moving snapshots, at once present and memory, meant to be preserved and revisited. In doing so, they anticipated later practices, from home movies in Super 8 or video to today's digital self-representations on platforms like Instagram. But Notari's films were private, but not privatizing. Unlike today's individualized media, her cinema was collective, a shared personal archive of community life. And yet, while her films traveled widely and she opened an office in New York, Elvira herself never crossed the ocean. As her son Eduardo recalled, and I quote, "Despite all the invitations she received, she preferred to stay in Naples, sending her admirers only beautiful animated postcards," end quote. But America returned to her as image and sound because it was a journey of the imagination. In one hand-painted sequence, we can feel the allure of the American dream and sense this director's authorial desire. A woman sits atop a large drum to place this instrument, inscribed with the words, "Jazz, jazz, hop, hop, whoopee." Okay, so One final question remains that I would like to address. Why did I spend so much energy reconstructing this Naples, New York story? Well, one often travels to discover one's own geography. Before we could speak of auto theory, Streetwalking on a Ruined Map offered a subjective journey, a close, intimate voyage to Italy. As I tried in my imagination to move, provoke, and listen to the silent voice of Elvira Notari and to feel the resistance that had silenced her, I could not silence what emerged from my own voice. Through Notari's eyes and location shooting, I was able to rediscover and depict Naples, my Italian city of origin, which I had left as a young woman to live in New York. The ruined map, then, is a specific journey, a story of parting and reconnecting. Loss and incompletion became the movement of migration, the wounds of separation. And it took real work of joining things together to transform the lacerations of a ruined map into connected threads, turning it into the generative journey of a book, a story that now continues in the documentary Elvira Notari, Beyond Silence. In the 30 years since I first published Streetwalking on a Ruined Map, I've been relinked many times with Naples and Elvira Notari. As the philosopher Edouard Glissant beautifully puts it, and I quote, relation relinks, relays, relates, but the relinked, the relayed, the related cannot be combined conclusively. Let me then close this talk with one last open story on how the ruined map continues to be relinked, relayed, and related. In 2017, I was asked to curate the art exhibition Carta Bianca for the Museo di Capodimonte in Naples. Returning to Naples and relinking pieces of my ruined map, I devised a strategy for the exhibition that reflected the cultural mapping of the Notari's book, which in a way was itself a curatorial practice. Carte blanche was given to curate a space freely from the 47,000 pieces of artworks of the museum's holding, for which, of course, there was no complete database at all. Following my scholarly inclination, I set aside masterpieces usually on display and instead requested access to the museum's extensive storage rooms. Acting as an archaeologist accustomed to streetwalking, I explored these storages as spaces and geological strata, layers of the remains of time. It was no surprise that moving sideways and off well-traveled paths, I was drawn to artworks worn down by time, ruined, partly lost. I eventually found what I wanted, a storage space filled with accumulated canvases, many unattributed, too damaged to be restored. The museum didn't know what to do with these derelict canvases, but I did. They had to be shown. No matter what resistance or critique I would encounter, this collection of pictorial surfaces, whose very fabric revealed the fabrication of history, had to become an exhibition. And it had to display the method, the curatorial process I first devised in writing Streetwalking on a Ruined Map. But how could this be done? To communicate the force of these ruined objects, I chose to reconstruct within the exhibition space the very logic of museum storage. I mounted the paintings on large metal grids, just as is strapped in storage on vertical panels that slide along tracks. Displayed in this way, the canvases exhibited their unstable, contingent existence. Weathered, scratched, stained, wounded, decayed, even disintegrating, these paintings bore the atmospheric mark of time on their surfaces with striking elegance. By exposing their materiality, my curatorial tapestry also exposed a method, a curatorial design. It reimagined how objects assembled in storage and marked by history's erosion could form unexpected constellations across time, geography, genre, and authorship, producing a less canonical view of visual history. To extend this ruined map, I introduced wide fabric panels functioning as curtain screens, both separating and connecting zones of display, inviting viewers to follow a narrative, cinematic path. Although there were no contemporary artworks shown in Carta Bianca, the works arranged on screen-like grids suggested a filmic montage, a sequence of frames, fragmented images, ruined pieces of celluloid. Curating Sarta Bianca then relinked me very closely to streetwalking on a ruined map, even in uncanny ways. To conclude the exhibition, I wanted to suggest that this curatorial design, the delicately woven ruined map staged on a gridded archival screen, constitutes a processual and a feminist strategy of interpretation. One day, entering a storeroom, I approached a panel on which paintings hang in stillness and slid it along its track to see what might appear. And there she was, Saint Agatha, painted by Francesco Guarino in 1640. Serendipity had placed this image once again in my path, relinking me to it and offering closure to the exhibition. In 1993, I had placed this exact painting on the cover of Streetwalking on a ruined map. I had paired it to a frame enlargement from Notari's extant film A Santa Notte, in which Nanninella, a stabbed Popolana, exposes the scar on her breast. In a spiral of unfinished relations, both figures resurfaced, confronting me with their piercing gaze. 30 years ago, I brought them together so that their stories could be linked. And 25 years later, in Carta Bianca, they were once again relinked, relayed, and related. Agatha, from the 17th century, born the mark of resistance, injured for defying socio-sexual roles. Until also was Nanninella, whose scarred image you will encounter again in Elvira Notari, Beyond Silence. Wounded, yet no longer forgotten. Thank you.
This was absolutely brilliant, and I see Elizabeth is standing, and we are all standing with our heart. You gave us not only a very informative lecture on Elvira Notari, but you gave us a method, you gave us an insight in your own personal journey, and the most perfect introduction to the documentary we could ever imagine to have. We have time for a couple of questions, if you're really quick in asking them.
You don't want the pizza.
You don't want the pizza to be cold. We have Naples here. Any question? Yes.
Thank you so much for this magnificent lecture. Truly formidable and fascinating. My question is rather unexpected because it goes way back to the beginning of your lecture when you mentioned places in Brooklyn where Italian Americans got together. Where in Brooklyn were those places?
Well, they were everywhere at that time, but there were a lot of social clubs, you know, even in Manhattan. I used to live on Sullivan Street, which originally was actually an Italian-American street, even if it was a little bit off of Little Italy. And even below my apartment, there was one of those social clubs. So I didn't have to go that far. I started, you know, over there and then moved around, went to Little Italy, where there were a number of, actually one is still standing. You know, there were bookstores. One still exists. They used to be actually publishers. And they published songs. In fact, they published some of the work of Gennariello, of the son of Notari. One of these places, actually, I went to revisit it when they were making the documentary, you know, to see what had happened in the three decades. And they have an enormous storage underneath that has all of these papers and all of these things that were published for Italian Americans. And some of them were very interesting because that's actually where I I found some of the Carolina Invernizio novels that inspired Notari's film. They were no longer printed in Italy, but in some of these places for Italian-American audiences, I have a whole collection, fantastic graphic, of these, women's popular novels from the 19th century. Then there were the mafia clubs. They were a little more complicated, and it was a little more difficult for me to, walk inside and say hello. What exactly do you want? I'm looking for, an Italian woman filmmaker. But I did find that at that time, some people even remembered to see some of these films in the 14th Street theaters, wherever there were these Italian theaters that showed their films. So it was very interesting. And also, you find out that there's a whole connection because the grandfather of Francis Ford Coppola then became one of the distributors and the producer of these films. So there was a connection, that was very strong that went from that time to other times. And I actually have to really thank my husband, Andrew Fearberg, because he drove me around everywhere and sometimes, smoothed out some of the impact of having this, young woman looked pretty good at that time, walking in these mafia clubs, looking for a silent Italian filmmaker.
Well, thank you. It was really wonderful. Have you met any of the descendants of Elvira descendants?
Okay, I don't want to be, you don't want to spoil a movie. So I'm not going to spoil the movie. What I would say is that there were not a lot of help. In fact, no help at all, just to be clear. And that is part of the silence. It's part of what kind of legacy, even within one's own family, does a work of some extraordinary woman filmmaker have. So when you see the documentary, you will see what I mean by this.
Giuliana, one question about the title of your book. I know you had to fight to keep Streetwalking in the title. How come you were so determined to keep it, and what were the objections of your publisher at the time?
My publisher hated this title. They said, absolutely no. The book itself had a kind of interesting, journey from dissertation to being published. And when I republished the book in Italian in 2023, I actually told the story because I think a lot of my students think that you're born famous or that you write something brilliant and everyone wants it. No. It's like it doesn't happen that way. As we all know, when I was a student at NYU, and Jay Lida, who was one of my mentors, a wonderful film historian, died. His wife wanted to throw away everything, and then we graduate students went and searched for. And tried and made an exhibition, and we found a letter from Walter Benjamin to Jay Lida, who said, I've written this little essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Mechanical Reproduction, and Theodore thinks it's pretty good, but I can't find anyone to publish it in English. Can you help me? Right? So the same thing happened to my book. When I first gave it to one publisher that remains unnamed, they said, what is this ruined map story, this method of going through all of these disciplines? Why don't you just write a book that is 3 textual analysis of the 3 films that remain? I was a young woman. I just studied at Harvard, where notoriously no one gets tenure, let alone a woman. And I said, no. I'm sorry. No, this is not the point, So then came finally Princeton University Press, who was more adventurous, but they hated the title. And at some point, she didn't know how to convince me and said, do you want to go down to history of someone who writes the history of prostitution? I said, yeah, what's wrong with that idea? Sounds good. No problem. It's kind of fine. I kept it also because there is a lot in the book about flânerie. This was the first time, in some way, that the connection between being a flaneur and a film spectator was established in film theory. So I had written an essay in October called Streetwalking Around Plato's Cave, to mean that cinema is not this enclosed site of just gaze and complete immobility, but it's connected to the urban environment. It's connected to moving around the city, arriving at the theater, leaving the theater with the film in your head. And there's something about that motion that is very much part of the movement of moving images. Besides the fact that Metropolis, arcades, train stations, and cinema were born together. Cinema is an agent of modernity. So the basic tenet of the film, theoretically, is that there is a connection between cinema and flânerie. But the flaneur was a flaneur. There was no flaneuse. The flaneuse is an invention of feminist theory. So a woman who walks the street is a prostitute. Right? A man who walks the street is a flaneur. The woman who walks the street is a prostitute. So it was important to me to keep that idea of street walking on a ruined map, both to give the sense of the flânerie, but also to make this kind of feminist point about the gender difference.
Thank you so much. Now,